Hey guys, my name is Solorio, and this is my presentation on the power of framing, media influence of perception, and reality. My target audience for this presentation is Gen X middle class workers who appreciate practical solutions, consistent value, and messaging that respects their time and experience. And later on in the presentation, I'll get into why I specifically chose Gen X middle class workers. So, why it matters, right? The two headlines, both from the LA Times articles. On the left, all of LA is not a war zone. We separate facts from spin and disinformation amid immigration raids. Contrary to the right, protesters or agitators. Who is driving chaos at LA immigration protests? On the one on the left, the words highlighted, not a war zone. Disinformation. That's the words they use. And the visual that they use with the flower, right? Which I think describes peace, beauty, in that sort of realm. And the one on the right, which differs from that, protesters, agitators, chaos. And they use a picture of destruction, cars burning, graffiti, masked man, which I think describes, they're trying to describe as anarchy, destruction, chaos. This is framing. Both articles talk about the same topic, the immigration raids or the immigration protests, but with a different narrative. One talking about this is a peaceful protest, and the other is talking about this is not a peaceful protest, this is straight up chaos. Framing theory helps us explain why certain messages influence more than others and shows how the way information is presented can shape our decisions, attitudes, and how we go about our daily lives. So, what is framing theory? Framing theory was created by Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman in 1974 by his book Framing Analysis. Basically, it's a model that explains how information is presented in a certain or specific way to an audience, right? So the same audience can interpret it or consume it in the manner that the entity, the business presenting the information wants them to interpret it or consume it. The four key components I'd say is selection, with emphasis, exclusion, and elaboration. Selection being selecting certain details from that story to fit their narrative. Emphasis is emphasizing those certain details. Exclusion is excluding details that don't fit their narrative. And elaboration, which elaborates on those selected and emphasized certain details. My visual here explains also that where 66% empty, the way you frame things, 66% empty, right? Being we're still a long way to go. It's more of a negative connotation to it. We still have 66% to go. While on the right, 33% full is saying we accomplished something, we did something, and we're going towards that. So it's more of a positive thing. So how you frame that is a real big deal. That's why framing theory is important. So Gen X. I chose Gen X middle class workers because they're the majority of the workforce. They are the generation born from 1965 to 1980. So the oldest would be around 60 years old and the youngest would be around 45. So they are big in the workforce. Topics that interest them a lot is inflation, taxes, and housing, which makes sense because they are mostly the breadwinners of their house, of their household. So economic issues is what what interests them. Yeah, interests them the most, which makes a lot of sense. How these topics are framed affect how they interpret, support, and possibly vote on it. Like last election, inflation was a big topic. The right saying that the last administration was they did a horrible job in it in controlling or doing the stuff for the economy, right? The inflation was bad, and the right really attacked the left on that and said we're going to do a better job, we're going to do this, and how they framed that was saying this is horrible. This is a horrible economy. The inflation is horrible. Everything goes up. But if you put me in there, everything's going to go down. And that's how they framed it from the right side. On the left side, they did somewhat acknowledge that prices were up, but they slid it under the rug saying it's okay. We can fix that. And that's how they framed it. That's why, again, same topic, talking about inflation, but different narrative. How they framed that is what was important. and what can help voters support certain things. Frame narratives highlight some problems, exclude others, and tell which interpretations or choices are better for them, which I was basically saying with my example. My visual here basically says how Gen X paid more attention to negative framing rather than the positive or neutral frame with the 78% rating or influence, percentage of influence. They paid more attention to negative headlines, which would make sense because if they were to, of a framing headline were to say inflation is on the rise, they look at that. Or taxes, your taxes will go up. They'll pay attention more to that. Or housing is down. They'd pay more attention to that. As Gen X just is paying more attention to that, as we could see from the survey. One of my examples is Dong and Nizam's The Upgrade of Framing Theory in the Social Media Era. Basically, they highlight platform governance and power dynamics that describe moderation and rules for social media companies to set policies that limit or allow certain frames. So basically, what they're saying is that government or state-owned businesses, companies, newspapers, or even capitalistic ones or private ones, they play power dynamics, right? They moderate rules, how certain narratives are framed to set policies that fit their narratives. An example, right, is in China, right? Certain feminist or gender equality frames dispute with government regulations or platform policies, which in turn affects when gender discourse are visible, allowed, or suppressed, using that framing narrative. This case shows that platforms, by using policy and algorithm, determine which frames continue and gain far more exposure than probably they would want or use. Conclusion, right? So framing theory explains how the presentation of information influences how audience interpret and understand a message. It operates through the four components that I mentioned: selection, emphasis, exclusion, and elaboration, which can shape public perception. Real world cases like the one I presented of Dong and isms, they work on platform governance, like I was saying, and this can affect groups like middle class families by shaping their views on economic issues such as the friends we're talking about, inflation, taxes, and housing, and how the example I used of elections are a big part of that on how the two political parties or the companies that support these parties frame certain policies so that the majority can vote on it or support their policies. And going back, to my sources in the beginning, the two LA Times pages on the left and on the right, uh, those contrasting headlines, right? One calling it not a war zone and disinformation, while they're on the right calling it chaos. Our daily media consumption shapes how we see the world before we form our own opinions. And framing isn't always obvious, but it's always there. It's ubiquitous. And when we can see the frame, we can finally see the full picture as we see in my visual. If you just look at the frame on the TV screen or on the camera, you believe that the man on the left is the bad guy and the one on the right is the victim. But when you see the whole picture, it's the opposite. And that's what framing is about. Different, same story, different narrative. Thank you guys for listening to my presentation. I'm on to it. And here are my references. Thank you guys for watching and listening.